In the case of Miranda versus Arizona 96, the U.S. Supreme Court decided in a 5-4 decision that a suspect must be informed of their right to counsel. This was a landmark decision that had a significant impact on law enforcement by having them say the Miranda rights. In this case of Roe v. Wade, a decision was made by the U.S. Supreme Court on the issue of abortion. In a 7-2 ruling, they decided a woman had the right to privacy under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. This gave women the choice to have an abortion. In an appeal in '89, Johnson argued that burning the American flag was symbolic speech and protected by the First Amendment. Then a decision by the Supreme Court said that in fact it was a symbolic speech and protected by the First Amendment in a 5-4 decision. In the case of Adkins v. Virginia in '02, was a case in which the Supreme Court of the U.S. ruled in a 6-3 ruling that the executing of mentally retarded was cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. They decided that states can decide who is mentally retarded, though. The case of Roper v. Simmons in '05 was a decision in which the Supreme Court of the United States held that it was unconstitutional to impose capital punishment for crimes committed while under the age of 18. The case of Duncan v. Louisiana in 1968 was a 7-2 decision, which the U.S. Supreme Court said that all states must follow the Sixth Amendment and have right to trial by a jury. The case of Lee v. Wiseman was a case about a public school involving prayer. In a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court ruled that it was not okay for public schools to have organized prayer led by a teacher or having to do with the clergy. The case of U.S. v. Miller in 1939 was a Supreme Court case that involved the Second Amendment. This challenged the National Firearms Act of 1934. Miller was often cited in the ongoing American gun politics debate. The Supreme Court rules that the school officials have the right to search belongings with a reasonable suspicion. In a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court sided with the state of New Jersey. In the case of D.C. v. Heller in '08, where the Supreme Court decided in a 5-4 decision that under the Second Amendment to the United States, citizens are allowed to possess a firearm for self-defense in their home. In a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court ruled that the school had the responsibility to have their students drug tested if they are involved in any school activities. The students argued this went against their Fourth Amendment rights, but the Supreme Court sided with the school district. This case was involving the First Amendment and if a reporter had to release their sources. In a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court ruled with Hayes. Although they get the information in confidence, they do not have the authority to keep the information during a government investigation. In a 9-0 decision, the Supreme Court decided on the side of Gideon. In this case, he was arrested with a felony and he asked to be appointed with an attorney. The state of Florida decided they did not have to give him an attorney, and the Supreme Court ruled this as unconstitutional. In this case, a 14-year-old boy in Florida was spanked 20 times by a teacher. He and his parents sued because of cruel and unusual punishment. The Supreme Court decided in a 5-4 decision supporting to the state of Florida. In the state of New York, they made a short voluntary prayer for reflection at the start of each day. Parents disagreed and sued. This was only focusing on the main Christian religion and excluding other students. There were 6-1 decision in favor of the excluding students because America was founded on the separation of church and state. In the case of Tinker versus Des Moines, there was a vote of 7-2 in favor of Tinker. This case was about the Vietnam War and if students could have the right to peacefully protest. They all wore black armbands and the school made them take them off. The Supreme Court ruled with the students. They said the school could limit the dress code to a point, but this was completely acceptable. The Duarte chapter of the Rotary in 1986 was kicked out and expelled from the club. This violated the California Civil Act prohibiting sexual discrimination. There was a 7-0 decision favoring the women because having them in the club would not prevent them from carrying out the club's purpose. In this case of Matt v. Ohio in 1961 was a case involving the criminal procedure. This was where the Supreme Court decided that evidence obtained in violation of the Fourth Amendment may not be used in state law criminal prosecutions. In the case of Bush v. Gore, the Supreme Court resolved a dispute surrounding the 2000 presidential election. This was a 5-4 decision involving the electors that each state have. Bush won the election via electors and the Gore won votes of the people. This made Bush officially win the election. In this case, in 1988, the Supreme Court held that the Fourth Amendment does not prohibit the warrantless search and seizure of the garbage left for collection outside. In this case, in 1964, the Supreme Court decided that the criminal suspects have right to counsel during police interrogations under the Sixth Amendment. The case was decided a year after the Gideon v. Wainwright, which involved that defendants had a right to be provided counsel at a trial. In this case, the Vernonia School District believed drugs would increase injuries, so they adopted the policy to randomly test students. This was taken to the Supreme Court in 1994 and was a 6-3 decision for the school district. In this case, the U.S. Supreme Court decided that the actual malice standard, which has to be met before press reports about public officials, can be considered to be defamation and libel. In this case of 1954, the Supreme Court declared that state laws establishing separate public schools for the black and white student to be unconstitutional. This was a 9-0 decision and was a significant civil rights case. In this case, in 1976, the Supreme Court decided that 7-2, the death penalty was a cruel and unusual punishment for the crime of rape. In this case of 2010, the Supreme Court decided that a U.S. constitutional law case dealing with the regulations of a campaign spending by organizations. The Supreme Court held that the First Amendment prohibited the government from restricting independent expenditures by a non-profit corporation. In this case of 1967, the U.S. Supreme Court dealt with the landmark civil rights case. This was the decision of interracial marriage. In many states, you could not legally be married, but the Lovings protested this and won. In this case, 1919, the U.S. Supreme Court decision concerning enforcement of the Espionage Act of 1917 during World War I, and a 9-0 decision for the United States because Schenck was involved in criminal activity at the time. In this case, in 1972, the Supreme Court decided that juries may convict a defendant by less than unanimity, even though federal law required that federal juries must reach criminal verdicts unanimously. In the case of U.S. v. Lopez in 1975, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress had exceeded its constitutional authority under the Commerce Clause when they passed gun possession law in school zones. In a 5-4 decision, the rule that Gun-Free School Zone Act was unconstitutional.